Margaret Wilson was 73 years old and had lived inside a state psychiatric hospital for so long that her name no longer seemed to matter. In the records, she was simply an elderly, long-term patient, stable, quiet, with no visitors. To herself, she was still a clear-minded woman who had learned how to survive by staying unnoticed, not because she had given up, but because she understood that visibility inside that place was dangerous. The hospital stood on the outskirts of Chicago, surrounded by tall fences, cracked sidewalks, and neglected green areas. The hallways smelled of disinfectant and time. Walls, once white, had turned dull and tired, much like the people who passed through them every day. Margaret arrived there at 43, walking straight, speaking calmly, fully aware of who she was. Decades later, her body carried the weight of unnecessary medication, but her mind remained awake and watchful. She remembered clearly the day her life broke apart. It was the early 1990s, a cold morning in her small house on the South Side. The coffee was weak, prepared by her daughter Susan, who barely looked at her while stirring the cup. Her son Daniel sat at the table, talking too much, smiling nervously, insisting that everything would be fine. They said they were worried, said Margaret was forgetful, confused, not acting like herself. She was surprised, but she did not argue. She trusted them. She had raised those children alone after her husband, Robert, passed away. Robert had been a construction worker who built that house room by room with his own hands. It was modest, paid off, and full of memories. Daniel suggested a medical appointment, just a checkup, a doctor he knew, nothing serious. Margaret agreed. She had no reason to suspect anything. Inside the office, she answered simple questions. She denied confusion, denied aggression, denied needing help. Every word was written down without warmth. Every explanation seemed to confirm a decision already made. Before noon, she was told she would be admitted for observation. 72 hours, they said, a routine procedure. Margaret protested, asked to call someone, demanded to go home. Her reaction was labeled agitation. Her fear became evidence. Hours turned into days, days into weeks. Margaret cried, begged, wrote letters. She asked for a lawyer, asked to see a judge. No one answered. Her children visited less and less. When they finally returned, they brought papers. They said it was temporary, that they needed permission to manage her assets while she recovered. Margaret refused. She said she would never sign away her home. She said she would rather die there than lose everything she and Robert had built. After that, they disappeared. Time lost its shape. Margaret learned the unspoken rules quickly. Asking questions meant stronger medication. Resisting meant isolation. Compliance meant survival. So she complied. She smiled when expected, thanked nurses for care she did not need, pretended improvement. She learned how to hide pills instead of swallowing them, how to protect her thoughts by appearing calm. 30 years passed. One afternoon, already old, she heard 2 staff members talking near her door. They mentioned an audit, long-term patients, forgotten files, property still registered under names of people who never left the hospital. One of them mentioned an elderly woman admitted in the 1990s whose house was still listed under her name. Margaret felt her heart race. Her house still existed. That night, she did not sleep, not from fear, but from something she had buried for decades. Hope, the certainty that not everything had been erased, the quiet realization that her story was not finished yet. From that day on, Margaret Wilson was no longer just surviving. Outwardly, she remained the same quiet, compliant patient, the elderly woman no one worried about. Inside, however, something had shifted. If her house still existed on paper, then she herself had not been erased. Her children had betrayed her, the system had failed her, but the truth had endured. Margaret began to study the hospital with new eyes. For years, observation had been a defense. Now it became strategy. She noticed patterns in staff schedules, how shifts changed with mechanical precision, how some corridors were barely monitored. Cameras did not cover every angle. Doors were checked out of habit, not attention. No one imagined that a fragile old woman might still be planning. Her body was her greatest limitation. Decades of medication she never needed had weakened her muscles, slowed her reflexes, drained her strength. Still, she tested herself quietly. During permitted walks, she counted steps, measured distances, listened to her breathing, noted the pain in her knees. She did not rush. She understood that patience had already carried her through 30 years. She also began saving what little she could, loose change forgotten in pockets, a small bill occasionally sent by a distant cousin who still mailed Christmas cards. She hid everything inside the lining of her mattress. She did not know how much a bus ride cost anymore, or if public transportation even worked the same way, but she trusted that money still opened doors. Among the staff, there was one nurse who stood out. Her name was Emily. She was not friendly, but she was respectful. She called Margaret by her name, not by her diagnosis. Sometimes she looked away when handing out medication, trusting routine more than suspicion. Margaret noticed, and she used those moments to stay clear-headed, slipping pills into her pocket instead of swallowing them. The idea did not come all at once. It took months to form. Margaret chose a rainy night, a Friday, fewer staff, less supervision. She managed to get hold of a gray maintenance jumpsuit from the supply room and covered her white hair with a simple scarf. In the cracked bathroom mirror, she no longer looked like a patient. She looked like an exhausted worker finishing a long shift. Her heart pounded as she stepped into the hallway. She walked steadily, not fast, not slow, like someone who belonged there. No one stopped her. The side exit was locked, but the alarm system had been broken for months. When she pushed the door open, cold rain hit her face. It was the first time in 30 years she felt real rain. The walk to the road was brutal. She slipped, fell, stood up again. Every step hurt. Every sound felt dangerous. By the time she reached the bus stop, her entire body was shaking. She did not know if they still accepted cash. She did not know where the bus would take her. When it stopped, she climbed on without thinking. The driver looked at her for a moment longer than usual, but said nothing. Margaret sat in the back and cried silently, not from sadness, but from relief. No files, no labels, no locked doors, just an old woman heading home. Hours later, she stepped off in a neighborhood she recognized by instinct. Old trees, faded streetlights. She walked slowly until she reached her street. When she saw the house, the shock was overwhelming. Overgrown yard, broken windows, rusted gate. It did not look like a home. It looked abandoned, forgotten, wounded. Still, she knew it was hers. Margaret forced her way in through the back door. The smell of dust and decay filled her lungs. Every room held memories and loss. In the living room, she stopped in front of the bookshelf Robert had built decades earlier. Her hands trembled. She remembered his voice, his caution, his habit of hiding what mattered. Pressing the false panel exactly where he had once shown her, she felt it give way. The compartment opened. Inside lay a metal box, a thick envelope, and an old cassette tape. Margaret sank to the floor, her heart racing. This was not just memory, it was proof, and whatever truth waited inside, she knew it would change everything. Margaret spent the rest of the night sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by yellowed papers in a silence that felt heavier than the hospital walls she had escaped. Pale morning light crept through broken windows as she read every document with care. The original deed to the house, old bank records, notes written in Robert's handwriting, steady and deliberate, as if he had known how important these words would become. At the bottom of the envelope, she found a letter. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. Robert wrote about his fears, about Susan's growing impatience, about Daniel's debts and constant requests for money. He wrote that he had overheard conversations that did not sit right, plans whispered too quietly, questions that were not about care but control. He wrote that he feared something would happen to Margaret once he was gone. Robert explained that he had gathered evidence, recorded conversations, copies of agreements, and he wrote that if Margaret was reading this, then his worst fear had come true. The most devastating discovery came next, a medical report dated just days before Margaret's commitment. The psychiatrist stated clearly that there was no clinical reason for involuntary hospitalization. Yet on the same page, the doctor agreed to proceed based on the children's claims in exchange for cash payment. Both Susan and Daniel were named. The signature was unmistakable. Margaret felt the room spin. It had not been a misunderstanding. It had not been caution. Her own children had paid to erase her. They had bought her silence, her confinement, her disappearance. She stayed there as the day passed, unable to move. Her body ached from the escape, from age, from shock. When she finally tried to stand, her legs nearly failed her. She knew she could not remain in the house. If anyone saw her, if authorities were called, she would be taken back, and this time she would never leave. She hid in the basement for days, slept in short, restless stretches, ate little, only went out at night to buy water and bread with the money she had found. Every distant siren froze her blood. Every slowing car felt like a threat. More than once, she considered giving up. The hospital was cruel, but it was familiar, safe in its own way. But then she remembered Robert's words, and she kept going. An old wound on her back became infected. Her knee swelled painfully. Still, she forced herself to walk to the public library nearby. No one questioned her. She sat at a computer, hands unsteady, eyes strained. Technology had changed, but determination had not. She searched the psychiatrist's name, found he had retired, found old complaints buried and ignored. She searched her children's names. Daniel appeared linked to lawsuits and unpaid debts. Susan appeared smiling in professional photos, selling expensive homes, successful and respected. Margaret printed everything she could until her money ran out. With the papers folded carefully in her bag, she walked to a small legal aid office she found listed on a bulletin board. She had no idea if anyone would listen. For 30 years, no one had. A young attorney greeted her, calm voice, focused eyes. Margaret told her story from the beginning. The weak coffee, the doctor's office, the locked doors, the rain-soaked escape. She handed over the letter, the report, the evidence. The attorney read silently. When she looked up, she said something Margaret had not heard in decades. She said she believed her. But she also warned her. Time had passed. The people involved had resources. Going forward could bring retaliation, public scrutiny, attempts to discredit her again. Margaret listened, then spoke softly. They had already taken 30 years from her. She was not afraid anymore. From that moment on, Margaret Wilson's life was no longer invisible. The attorney kept her word and pushed the case beyond what Margaret believed possible. Old files were reopened, records were requested. A journalist with a reputation for uncovering institutional abuse took interest in her story. As details emerged, other names surfaced, other families, other elderly patients committed under similar circumstances signed by the same doctor. What had been dismissed for decades as an isolated case slowly revealed a pattern. When the story became public, the hospital released carefully worded statements speaking of outdated practices and long-past administrations. The psychiatrist, now very old, never stood trial. Time shielded him from prison, but not from exposure. His name became permanently tied to negligence and corruption. That was not the justice Margaret had imagined, but it was the truth brought into the light. Daniel vanished before investigators could reach him. He left behind debts, court records, and unanswered questions. Susan tried to defend herself. She claimed fear, claimed confusion, claimed she believed she was helping her mother. But documents told another story. Her signature appeared where it should not have. Her presence was recorded. Her role could no longer be denied. The legal process ended in a settlement. Margaret's house was officially returned to her name. A financial fund was created to cover her medical care and living expenses for the rest of her life. There were no apologies worth keeping. Margaret did not ask for any. Some betrayals do not need words. They need acknowledgement. Restoring the house took months. The roof was repaired, windows replaced, walls repainted. Margaret made one request. The bookshelf in the living room was not to be touched. The hidden compartment remained, exactly where Robert had built it, a quiet reminder of foresight, love, and truth waiting patiently. Each morning, Margaret sat by the window as sunlight filled the room, simple moments she had been denied for 30 years. She moved slowly, her body marked by time and loss, but her presence felt whole again. She had not recovered her youth, she had not recovered her husband, she had not recovered the years stolen from her, but she had recovered something just as powerful: her name, her voice, her story. When asked how she felt after everything, Margaret paused. She said she did not feel revenge. She did not feel complete happiness. She felt something deeper. She felt seen. She felt that the world had finally stopped calling her unstable and started calling what happened to her by its real name, an injustice. Stories like Margaret's are not only about the past, they are warnings. They remind us what happens when voices are ignored, when systems are trusted without question, when age is mistaken for weakness. If this story moved you, take a moment to think. How many people around you may have tried to speak and were dismissed? How many truths were silenced because listening was uncomfortable? Leave your comment. And if you want to keep hearing stories that refuse to stay buried, follow the channel. Because as long as silence exists, injustice will always find a place to hide.